and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to become the first foreign leader to meet the US President Donald Trump since his second term began. Their meeting is expected to happen next week. In just a moment, we'll be joined by the political scientist Norman Finkelstein to take a closer look at what the future holds for Israeli-Palestinian relations. And in line with the ceasefire deal, tens of thousands of Palestinians are continuing to make the journey home to northern Gaza after 15 months of displacement. Well, many are finding scenes of total devastation on arrival. Hello and welcome to the programme. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to become the first foreign leader to visit the White House since President Donald Trump began his second term. This follows on from an invitation from the White House. Well, in the invitation letter, President Trump said that the two men would be discussing how to bring peace to Israel and its neighbours. Well, that meeting is expected to be held on the 4th of February. Well, the last time the two men met face-to-face was last year in Florida. Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit comes as just days after President Trump suggested that residents of Gaza could leave the territory and be resettled in Egypt and Jordan. Well, that idea has been criticised and rejected by regional leaders. Well, for more, we can speak now to Gidi Grinstein, who is the former Israeli peace negotiator under Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who joins us from New York. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. As we were saying there, Prime Minister Netanyahu to be the first foreign leader to meet President Trump since his second term began. How significant is that in your opinion?
Tom, thank you very much for having me on your show again. I believe it's a very, very important visit. In fact, it's a critical moment in the process of implementation of the Israel-Hamas prisoner hostage exchange ceasefire deal, because the first phase of the deal, which is 42 days long, is effectively divided into two stages. The first stage, 16 days, which ends on the coming Sunday, is when we had 3 exchanges of hostages and prisoners and some Israeli withdrawal, and we also saw the scenes of of Gazans going back to northern Gaza, as well as extensive traffic of humanitarian aid into Gaza. But the second phase, the remaining 26 days of the first phase of the deal, during that period, we're supposed to see 4 additional exchanges of hostages and prisoners, as well as the beginning of negotiation of the implementation of the second phase of the deal, meaning day 43 to day 84. And when it comes to that second phase, it's much less clear what the parties are expected to do. Now, in Israel, among the right wing and among many of the supporters of this government and of Prime Minister Netanyahu, there was a little bit of a shock, actually a significant shock, by the deal that was struck with Hamas, by the fact that so much aid came into Gaza, that Hamas fighters were allowed to be seen on the streets like that. Also by the fact that by the amount of prisoners, Palestinian prisoners that were released in the deal, including very significant people that have a lot of blood on their hands. So for all these reasons, effectively the right wing in Israel and the right wing in America is colluding to prevent the continuation of the implementation of the deal, meaning not going into phase 2. So when Prime Minister Netanyahu comes to Washington, the first thing he's going to be speaking about is about the recognition from Washington, from President Trump, to go back into war, to go back to pursuing war against Hamas. The second thing is, of course, the normalization with Saudi. And the third major issue is Iran. Israel sees a historic opportunity to basically eliminate or set back significantly the Iranian nuclear project. And of course, there is the Syrian, Lebanese, Israel political opportunity that was created by the dramatic change in Syria and by the outcome of the war of Israel and Hezbollah. So a very full agenda, but this is a very critical moment because if Israel goes back to war with Hamas, the likelihood of normalization with Saudi is significantly postponed.
All right. I just want to ask you about the state of relations between the two men, because relations are reported to have soured briefly back in 2020 when Prime Minister Netanyahu congratulated President Biden for his election victory. Has the relationship been patched up, do you think?
I'm not sure. There are conflicting reports about that. Certainly, they were not. The relationship right now are not what they were in the past. There were also significant rumors that Netanyahu was going to be invited to the inauguration, but then he was not. There was another set of rumors that his wife and son were going to be invited to the inauguration. To the best of, at least in the media, they were not present there. And there are a lot of people around Trump who support or endorse a much more pragmatic outlook for the resolution of the war in Gaza and tied to advancing normalization with Saudi, which, and this, I would say, universe or ecosystem around Trump is very suspicious of the very right-wing coalition that Netanyahu has circled himself in Israel. So I think it's going to be a very sensitive meeting between the two men. I think on camera it will look good, but behind the scenes there is conflicting views, at least with regard to what the next steps in Gaza, and also the prioritization of the normalization with Saudi. Again, as I said, most people that in my assessment, and also most people that I spoke to in Washington over the last few days, don't believe that that pursuing normalization with Saudi, that you can pursue normalization with Saudi while going back to war. Meaning those two goals are conflicting, and therefore those who want normalization with Saudi will want to see an implementation of the ceasefire deal with Hamas in Gaza.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Gidi Grinstein, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, for more analysis on the latest developments relating to Israel and the Palestinian territories, we can speak now to the renowned Middle East researcher and political scientist, Professor Norman Finkelstein, who joins us from New York. Professor Finkelstein, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Al Arabiya News. I wanted to start by asking you about one of the week's top stories. We heard that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is going to be the first foreign leader to meet President Donald Trump since he began his second presidency. What sort of a message do you think that sends to the Palestinians? And what do you think the new administration has in store for the Palestinians and their aspirations for statehood?
The message, I think, is threefold. First of all, it's to appease Donald Trump's base, a large part of which is, here I'm referring to the Republican Party, a large part of which is enthusiastic about Israel. Number two, it's to placate or appease the billionaire Jewish supremacists like Bill Ackman, the billionaire Bill Ackman, who supported Donald Trump. He left he defected from the Democratic Party, and he supported Donald Trump because of his expectation that Trump would give the Israelis a free hand. And number three, in general, he wants to transmit the message that international law will have no part in his administration, that even though a search warrant has been issued by the International Criminal Court against Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as the former Defense Minister Gallant, that those kinds of considerations, i.e., the rule of law, will be ignored or flouted by the Trump administration. As to the prospects, my guess is that Donald Trump will give the Israelis a free hand so long as it doesn't become an international crisis in Gaza. So if quietly the Israelis can block any humanitarian aid from entering Gaza, if quietly the Israelis can prevent the rebuilding, the reconstruction of Gaza, if quietly the Israelis can force a fait accompli on the Palestinians in Gaza, namely stay and starve or leave, then President Trump will happily go along with it. But he's sufficiently knowledgeable to know that if it becomes a public international issue, that it could become a quagmire for his administration, as it did for the Biden administration.
Okay, so this idea of resettling people from Gaza in Egypt and Jordan, which we heard about from President Trump during the weekend, it's been flatly rejected by both countries concerned. It's also been flatly rejected by the Arab League. But what you're saying is perhaps we haven't necessarily heard the last of it.
I do not believe we've heard the last of it for the following reason. Gaza is no more as a physical fact. The estimates by the UN are that 92% of the residences, the homes in Gaza, have been destroyed or severely damaged. About 2/3 of the infrastructure has been destroyed. There are about 50 million tons of rubble in Gaza, intermixed with unexploded ordnance and toxic chemicals, toxic substances. So the estimates are it will require probably about 15 years, maybe more, if 100 trucks are admitted a day, which is almost impossible to imagine Israel allowing. It would take about 15 years just to empty out the rubble. Now, Israel will use the excuse that if it allows cement to enter Gaza, which is obviously a sine qua non of reconstructing Gaza, Israel will use the pretext that it can't admit cement because Hamas will reconstruct its tunnels. So the people of Gaza are going to be confronted with a very stark reality, namely, there is nothing to return to, and Israel will have achieved its primary goal, its primary aim the past 15 months has been to, quote, make Gaza unlivable. Let me repeat that. Their primary goal was to make Gaza unlivable. And as things now stand, it is literally unlivable. And so the people of Gaza will be confronted with a very stark choice, which is either to stay and die or to leave. And at that point, by hook or by crook, I believe large numbers of Palestinians Gazans will figure out a way, no doubt facilitated by Israel, will figure out a way to leave.
You're making it sound as though a Palestinian statehood has almost never looked more distant a prospect than it does now, not least with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in power. How do you think history is going to look back on a figure like Prime Minister Netanyahu?
I frankly am not particularly interested in how history with a capital H looks back on any figure, because the question is always who is writing that history. If it's history as written by the victims, he's obviously a genocidal, Jewish supremacist, obnoxious, narcissistic, genocidal murderer. And that would be the proper verdict, were it the people, the victims, who write the history. But if it's written by the faithful, loyal scribes of power, institutions like the BBC, institutions like the New York Times, if it's written by those folks, then the record will be that, yes, he did some wrong things, but he was, of course, loyal and faithful to his people.
We were just talking before we crossed to you about the ceasefire that's been in place now in Gaza and has kept the peace for the last week and a half or so. I'm just wondering, President Donald Trump has taken considerable credit for that ceasefire deal being struck. How much credit do you give him for it?
I think that Donald Trump was faced with a dilemma. He announced that a month before he assumed his office, that unless the hostages were freed, there would be hell to pay in Gaza. And the problem was for Donald Trump, the hell was already paid in Gaza by President Joe Biden. There wasn't much more he can do in the way of unleashing hell. Secondly, he didn't want to begin his presidency on a monstrous note, which would be unleashing even more weaponry on the defenseless refugee child population. On the other hand, he didn't want to come across as a blowhard on his first day in office. Namely, he said there would be all hell to pay. He had to do something. And so given the two choices of appearing like a monster on his first day in office in a very unpopular, it wasn't a war, it was a genocide, in a very unpopular military action by Israel, and coming across as a blowhard, namely saying there would be all hell to pay and then doing nothing, between those two choices, he opted for telling Netanyahu, you have to sign an agreement that releases the hostages so he can claim that he followed through on his threat, and that the rest, the stage 2 and stage 3, would be consigned to the dustbin.
Just looking at who's in the new Trump administration, the ambassador to Israel, Huckabee, Elon Musk, looking at the inner sanctum, people surrounding Donald Trump, how well advised do you think he is on this particular issue? And what do you think it means for peace prospects, for the future of the Palestinian people, that President Trump is there with those people around him?
I do not believe there's much question, or there ought to be much focus on who's surrounding him. You can be surrounded by rednecks and bizarre figures, or you can be surrounded by very quote-unquote enlightened people like Tony Blinken. It doesn't really make much difference. The common denominator of all these people is very simple, that force works, that we have a near monopoly on force, and that if you consistently, persistently persevere in the resort to force, violent force, that you can get your way. So I don't think there's much utility in investigating the personalities of these people. When it comes to Israel-Palestine, literally only a flea's hop separates a Mike Huckabee from a Tony Blinken. Only a flea's hop.
So you don't think a figure like Elon Musk, who is shaping up to be a really important figure, he's already demonstrated he's a very important figure in the Trump administration. He wields enormous power on social media. He's also extremely close to President Trump. Do you think he might bring something, perhaps a new approach, a new way of looking at this historic problem?
No, I think there's too much of a fixation on flamboyant personalities and not sufficient recognition of the institutional investments in U.S. foreign policy, as well as the normal modus operandi of U.S. foreign policy, which is the exertion of maximal force. Elon Musk probably can't find Israel on a map and probably couldn't care less that he can't. And people like Mr. Huckabee and others, they have no special personal investment. And even if they did have a personal investment, such as the one by the billionaire Jewish supremacist Bill Ackman, he has a personal investment because his wife is a former Israeli pilot. So I imagine there is a lot of table talk at their estate about how to influence Trump. But the personalities surrounding Trump have no personal investment in Israel. And so it will be the default setting for all of them, which is maximal force to pulverize weak people.
Do you get the impression overall that the US public is particularly interested or particularly concerned about developments thousands of kilometers away in Gaza and in the Palestinian territories? And do you think they're well enough informed?
The U.S. public, I wouldn't say it is any more fickle than other publics. I would say the U.S. public is as prone to news headlines as any other public. And there was a certain point, in particular in the spring of last year, roughly a year ago now, when the student encampments seized the, if it's not imagination, it seized the attention of the U.S. public. And at that point, public concern was pretty steady, even though for a short period of time, and it had an impact on the Biden administration. However, the Jewish billionaire supremacist class, people like Bill Ackman, Barry Sternlicht at Brown University, Robert Kraft at Columbia University, they start to exert their financial leverage on the universities. They ousted, unprecedented in American history, they ousted 3 Ivy League college presidents, President Gay at Harvard, President McGill at University of Pennsylvania, and the president of Columbia University was eventually ousted. And then the marching orders by the billionaire Jewish supremacist class was to crush all resistance on the college campuses to the Israeli genocide in Gaza. Now it's gone a step further with Harvard University last week imposing draconian limitations of free speech at Harvard when it comes to Israel and Palestine. So to get back to your question, in my opinion, the main order of the day has to begin on the college campuses under the slogan of Free Gaza, Free Speech, namely the right to free speech and the right to freedom of assembly was crushed last spring around graduation time in May. And the challenge now has to be for every college campus in our country to seize on the slogan, Free Gaza, Free Speech, the right to speak your mind out on the genocide, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and the right of assembly. So in my opinion, they should set a date, maybe April 1st, 2025, where every college campus in our country simultaneously, in synchrony, sets up a new encampment. Now that would mean, in my opinion, a direct confrontation, not just with the university administrations, but with an emboldened President, Donald Trump. It would be a direct confrontation. But I think in terms of preserving what remains, the remnants of our democracy in this country, that's a confrontation that should be welcomed by the students, activists who will play a vanguard role in trying to win back that right to free speech, which was crushed not by the Trump administration, but by the Biden administration, but which Trump will no doubt capitalize on should there be resistance on the college campuses.
Yeah, and I just want to ask you, because I mean, some of our viewers might not be aware of the draconian measures that you're referring to on campuses. And I think you mentioned recently that words like Gaza and genocide are two words that are in fact forbidden in some university campuses. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm just wondering yourself as a professor, as an academic, what goes through your mind when you hear that centers of academic excellence are forbidding the discussion of important issues, essentially?
Well, what goes through my mind is how utterly spineless these university administrations are, how totally lacking in any principle whatsoever these administrations are, and how superficial, how cheap is their commitment to principles like academic freedom. You hear the term over and over again, proudly burnished by these universities. Academic freedom, the university being the ultimate marketplace or free marketplace of ideas, that no thoughts should be banned, that there should be no limits at the university setting on free speech, and how on the one hand and how on the other hand was so pitiful, so pathetic, how all these universities caved in to big money, to big donors, how easily, without even a whimper, how easily they sold all their so-called, their ballyhooed principles of academic freedom and free speech. It's so pitiful, so pathetic how these university administrations, beginning with Harvard, acquitted themselves. Remember, we're America. There's no threat of a military coup, of being jailed, of being disappeared, of being tortured in a in a chamber. We don't face those threats, which are faced by so many other peoples around the world. What threats do these universities face? They have, in the places like Harvard, they have tens and tens and tens of $1 billion in endowments. So they may lose from those tens of billions of dollars, they may lose, yes, it's true, a few $100 million in alumni donations. And because of that, you completely capitulate. You sell all your principles. It's so pitiful. The heroic poses they make. But then, at the moment of truth, all their principles collapse like a house of cards.
And as you mentioned just before I asked you that question, a lot of what you were talking about happened on the watch of the previous administration. It happened on President Biden's watch.
That's correct.
And I'm just wondering...
Yes, that should never be forgotten.
Right, and I just want to ask you whether you think ultimately his handling, not just of that issue, but issues right across the Middle East, in particular this issue of what's been happening in Gaza, do you think that's what cost them the election last year?
Obviously, there's been a lot of speculation on that question, and since it involves subtleties of analysis, of which I'm not capable because I've not studied the literature on the subject, I don't wish to comment. What I would want to say is, number one, however awful Trump turns out to be, we must remember that it was the Biden administration that gave the green light to the genocide in Gaza. Some people bewail the fact that Donald Trump says all the people in Gaza should be cleaned out and resettled elsewhere. Have we forgotten already that it was Secretary of State Blinken who went to Egypt and sent his emissaries to Egypt right at the beginning of the Gaza genocide, calling on Egypt to allow the Palestinians, people in Gaza, to be expelled to the Sinai? There is so far nothing new under the sun. It was all the basic principles were established under the Biden administration.
Professor Finkelstein, you've got a new book coming out later on this year entitled Gaza's Gravediggers, an inquiry into corruption in high places. Now, without giving too much away about the book, you do take aim at the International Court of Justice, in particular one individual, Julia Sebutinde, who is the president of the International Court of Justice. You single her out for some pretty serious misconduct, bribery, blackmail, plagiarism. And you say the ICJ failed Gaza. Why do you say those things?
I would not say as a blanket statement the ICJ has failed Gaza, the International Court of Justice. What I would say is the following. There has been an enormous amount of corruption in the international legal system, including the International Criminal Court, which needs to be distinguished from the International Court of Justice, including the International Criminal Court, where, and I want to emphasize what I'm about to say, it is not my opinion, it is not my feeling, it is the documentary record that shows, and here is what it shows based on my reading of it, my close reading of it. Number one, the chief prosecutor of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the chief prosecutor preceding the current prosecutor, Karim Khan. Her name was Fatou Bensouda from the Gambia. She was almost certainly being bribed or blackmailed by Israel. Almost certainly. The documentary record on her handling of what was the Mavi Marmara case, that was the flotilla, that was the humanitarian flotilla that was attacked by Israel on May 31st, 2010. That case went before the ICC, and Fatou Bensouda desperately and brazenly sought to crush that case in the ICC. She was almost certainly being bribed or blackmailed by Israel. The presiding judge in what's called the pretrial chamber 1, it's a very high position, the presiding judge, Peter Kovacs from Hungary, was almost certainly being bribed or blackmailed by Israel. Now, turning to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, it's almost certainly the case, based on having perused the documentary record, that the current president, she was just elevated to her office because the previous president now holds high office in Lebanon, that Julia Sebutindi, and I'm saying this with complete presence of mind and attending to all of the implications of what I'm saying, based on my examination of the documentary record, she is almost certainly being bribed or blackmailed by Israel. Exactly what happened. She is from the Uganda, almost a repeat performance of Fatou Bensouda at the International Criminal Court. And now it's Fatou Bensouda was the chief prosecutor in the ICC, and now Julia Sebutindi is the president of the ICJ. And she is almost certainly being bribed and blackmailed by Israel. The fact of the matter is, the presidency of the ICJ is now, or the president is enthralled to a foreign power. And that's a very serious issue. However, I would also want to say that the previous president of the ICJ, Joan Donoghue, who was from the United States, Joan Donoghue, after the ICJ found that Israel was plausibly committing genocide in Gaza, after that finding by the ICJ in January, I think it's January 26th, if my memory is right, January 26th, 2024, Joan Donoghue, the former president, went on the British BBC program Hard Talk, and she flagrantly and brazenly lied, L-I-E-D, she lied about what the ICJ found, and she stated that the ICJ did not find that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. That statement by her was a flat-out lie. So there is a huge amount of corruption at play in the ICC and the ICJ. However, it also has to be stated that the ICJ, notwithstanding what Joan Donoghue stated or lied about, it did, in my opinion, carry out its task, the challenge before it, beginning in January 2024, then again in February 2024, then again in March 2024, and then again in May 2024. Each time South Africa kept coming before the ICJ, and in my opinion, the ICJ did what it maximally could have done to stop the genocide. However, the enforcement mechanisms of the international community, in particular the Security Council, failed South Africa, and of course failed.
All right, Professor, we're going to have to cut you short because we're running out of time, and I want to move on to some other topics, notably the fact that Monday marked the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, where I believe your father was held, and he, of course, survived that ordeal. I want to ask you, as the son of two Holocaust survivors, both of whom passed away almost exactly 30 years ago, at a time when peace and the two-state solution looked perhaps closer than it's looked at any other time in modern history. What do you think they would make of the situation we're in today with regards to what's happening in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories?
I don't have any doubt about where my parents would stand. I would not want to whitewash who my parents were, and the fact that, like all of us, myself included, is filled with flaws, inconsistencies, hypocrisies. That's part of being human. However, on the question of human suffering, and in particular on the question of war and its horrors, my parents were, I believe I can say without any fear of being disingenuous, I believe I could say my parents were utterly, totally principled. Their hearts and their minds would reach out to the people of Gaza, and they would be unsparing in their condemnation of the monsters, the human monsters that currently occupy high office in Israel and their benefactors in the United States. And I am quite sure they would be emphatic in separating themselves, distancing themselves from the Israeli population. I'm not here talking about the Israeli state. The Israeli population, which has displayed, put on display the most horrible manifestations of human degradation and human corruption.
Okay, and just lastly, Professor, I want to ask you, at one stage there was a 10-year ban on you visiting Israel. You've actually been deported from that country, I believe, in the past. Have you tried visiting Israel again? Would you go there again? And what do you make of attempts, are there attempts by Israel to cast you as being some sort of a pariah?
I've made no attempts because it's quite obvious what will happen, and I don't see it as being economical, both in terms of time and cost, to go all the way, to journey all the way over there, only to be told that I'm not going to be allowed in. On the question of pariah, I do not, were it the case that I was a pariah, were it the case, I do not believe that being a pariah is in all circumstances a dishonorable position to occupy. If I might give just one example that comes to mind, there was the great German-born actress Marlene Dietrich. And Marlene Dietrich, during World War II, she sided with the Allies, the British, French, Russians, and Americans, the four main allies. She sided with the Allies against Germany. She was German-born. After the war, when she returned to Germany on occasion to perform, for example, she was jeered and attacked. She had become a permanent pariah in Germany for having committed treason and betrayed her people and her homeland. But in my opinion, in the hearts of all free people, free men and free women, she, like other Germans who quote unquote betrayed their country and betrayed their people, people like the Mann, Thomas Mann and Heinrich Mann, the Mann brothers, they will always be honored in the hearts of free men and free women, even as in their places of birth, they are pariahs.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We're going to have to leave there because we're out of time, but we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Professor Norman Finkelstein, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Now, in line with the ceasefire agreement, displaced Palestinians are continuing their journey home to northern areas of Gaza. Well, more than 300,000 people have now made that journey. But in some cases, they're finding on arrival conditions so dire that they're having to turn back around and return to the south. Well, for more on that and all the developments, we can speak now to Manuel Hassassian, the Palestinian ambassador to Denmark. Ambassador, it's great to have you with us again here on Al Arabiya News. I'd just like to start by asking for your reaction to today's news that we were covering at the top of the programme, that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will become the first foreign leader to visit the White House when he goes there next week. What's your reaction?
Well, actually, you know, after the election and the inauguration of President Trump, I think one of the major concerns in terms of foreign policy is the fact that the Middle East stands as a top priority for President Trump. And the question of stability and insecurity in the Middle East is a prime concern. And looking at the situation in the Middle East, we know that the crux of the problem is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And the recent developments that happened in Gaza has been, you know, basically an alarm to President Trump that without solving this issue, things will be unstable and things will not be according to the strategies of the United States in terms of controlling the Middle East and what have you. So Netanyahu is invited to go to the White House first to discuss the question of the ceasefire and to question the implementation of the ceasefire, and secondly, the prospects of trying to diasporize the Palestinians by ethnic cleansing and trying to force them to go into Egypt and basically Jordan is on the agenda between Netanyahu and President Trump, with the allegations that President Trump wants peaceful things for the Palestinians in Gaza to live in peace and not to live in a state of war and what have you. So, and the question of the West Bank with the increase of settlements also, and Trump's position on the question of allowing Netanyahu with a green light in more or less expanding settlements and in the future ceding the West Bank is in line basically with the policies of Netanyahu. So that's why they want just to brush on all these issues and you know, see how they could implement that as a process where, you know, the national interests of both will be preserved, and let alone there will be another vow from Trump to help Israel financially, militarily, and politically. And that's the significance of this trip.
You don't sound very optimistic. So viewed from the point of view of the Palestinians, those two men having those talks at the White House doesn't sound like it's going to bring anything positive for the Palestinian people.
No, I agree with you. There is nothing positive for the Palestinians. Now, if for the interim period, if the Palestinians are now moving from the south, in Gaza, from the south to the north, it's just to meet their loved ones and to see the catastrophe, the debacle that befell Gaza City and the north. That in itself basically is something that the Palestinians believe morally, that they are not being diasporized and they're not leaving their Gaza, and they are there even to put tents and live with the rebels that has been the consequence of such a brutal attack by the Israelis. But in the final analysis, the Israelis wanted basically not to have conducive conditions for the Gazans to come back by all this destruction, so as voluntarily the Gazans will accept the fact that they should move to Jordan, to Egypt, whatever the international community will offer them. But I believe that the predictions of the Israelis and the Americans are not in the right way, because the Palestinians in Gaza are determined to stay on their land.
Okay, so, these people who are returning to their homes, we've seen devastating scenes, and they're returning to really upsetting situations where their homes once stood. They're finding rubble and ruins. I mean, do you think they won't reach a stage when, with no construction materials coming into Gaza, they won't just want to go and live somewhere where they do have access to a more stable roof over their head, and that this plan to resettle them in other countries, you don't think it's going to work?
I don't think the Gazans are in a situation where they are ready to leave Gaza. Look, if you go down the streets in Gaza, and we have seen this on television, from our local televisions and what have you, and from the reports that we receive, not a single interviewee said that I am leaving Gaza. Even under the rubble, they said we will put our tents and live on our land. Nobody is going to force us to leave. So the resilience of the Gazans to stay on their land is a message to Trump and Netanyahu that it is only by genocide they can get rid of the Palestinians, and not by forceful diasporization, and not by creating dire conditions for them to live in.
And when you saw those pictures yourself as a Palestinian, what went through your mind when you saw people returning to total devastation?
Well, of course, we are saddened and we are shocked, we are baffled to see the remnants, of this destruction. In itself, for us, it made us believe that we are a people that believe in resurrection. And I think the Gazans are going to resurrect and overcome all these hurdles and all these calamities that they have faced in terms of destruction, in terms of killing, in terms of maiming and what have you. And I think the determination of the Gazan people themselves, along with the support of all the Palestinians in the West Bank and what have you, is to encourage them morally to stay and to meet the other hurdles of Mother Nature and the dire conditions that they are going to live for maybe several years to come until Gaza will be rebuilt and what have you. But in the meantime, what we believe in is that the resilience of these people who stayed under the heavy bombardments are not going to shy away, basically, from the natural disasters and the dire conditions that they will be facing, by going back to the north.
It doesn't sound like you think things are heading in the direction that the Palestinians would want them to. And I'm just wondering, with Benjamin Netanyahu in power, with Donald Trump in power, do you see any hope for a two-state solution, a lasting peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
I don't think a two-state solution or a lasting peace is going to be settled with Netanyahu. Netanyahu has an agenda. Netanyahu wants to see the West Bank. Netanyahu doesn't believe in a two-state solution. Netanyahu believes in occupation plus, and this is what Netanyahu wants. We cannot work with such a radical, conservative, extreme right-wing, government. And since Netanyahu's advent in the last 13 years, look what happened. No negotiations. We are at a stalemate, stuck between the historically inevitable and the politically impossible. And there is no progress in terms of negotiations. All we have seen from Netanyahu, destruction, control, raids, and what have you. So I cannot talk about a two-state solution in the presence of such a prime minister who is trying to stick to his power by creating facts on the ground. And while, as you know, he would be indicted as soon as he leaves office. And it seems that the society in Israel, still right-wing society, they cannot understand the realities that they cannot have peace without the Palestinians having their independent state. But in the near future, I don't see a two-state solution is intact, although the major talk of the town has always been by the international community, even by the United States of America, that the two-state solution is the best pragmatic solution to end this conflict. Now, what the Americans and Netanyahu is doing, basically they are managing this conflict, managing crisis, and trying to put us in situations where we have to be shying away from the concept of self-determination or the concept of having our independence through a two-state solution negotiated on international organization laws and regulations and UN resolutions. So with Netanyahu, I think it's a total stalemate. We cannot move 1 inch with that. But I tell you, the prospects of having peace in the Middle East and security in the Middle East is by having an independent Palestinian state. Although it is, as you know, it is a historic compromise to accept 22% of the land. But this is, the reality of the fact. We have to admit that we have accepted the state of Israel on 78% of the land. And we have said, yes, we go ahead with 22% having our own independent state.
Just lastly, Ambassador, one of the more curious announcements we've heard coming out of Washington in the last couple of days is this freeze on overseas assistance, which targets the Palestinians in Gaza. They say that there's a $50 million contraception distribution program in Gaza, and it's now going to be cut off. I'm just wondering what your reaction is to that. Apparently this was unveiled by Elon Musk's team, which is examining inefficiencies in the government. But are you concerned that with gestures like that, we're going to see basic needs of Palestinian people in Gaza simply no longer being met by international aid, and in particular from the United States?
Yeah. Well, we don't count on the American aid. We never counted on the American aid. And during the golden age of the Oslo process, we had like $500 million coming from the United States of America. Half of it goes to their international organizations operating in Palestine. So what we get from the Americans is pittance. So we don't put all our thoughts and our responsibility basically in having that kind of money in order to secure and salvage our situation. Our major contributor, as you know, is the European Union, where, hundreds of millions of euros come into the West Bank regularly. To the Palestinian Authority in terms of paying wages, paying infrastructure development, and what have you. So the main donor is Europe. If that stops, then your question makes me feel precarious at best that things are not going to be well going for the Palestinian Authority. But the American money is pittance.
Okay.
And secondly, as you know, we could have money coming from donations and from governments, Arab governments, constantly. We used to get them. Now they have been, a little bit controlled, by the international finances and by the Americans. But in the final analysis, never think that the American money and aid could really alleviate the miseries of the Palestinians. It's the Europeans and the Arab money that helps us.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're going to have to leave it there. Ambassador Manuel Hassassian, thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.